The word blessed hesitates to enter into routine parlance or conversation. But what I have witnessed in the recent weeks after the publication of the book is nothing common or ordinary. I have now no choice but to find records in the word blessed and reason with myself that the word has a greater halo of humanity than the omnipotence of divinity that the subject of my biography, Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda, has completely surrendered himself to. Mr. Deve Gowda is nearly a nonagenarian. He has read the book and has cryptically communicated to me that I have been fair to him, his work, his politics, and his times. I see in his response a graceful acceptance of the fact that no human, and certainly no prime minister, except perhaps the one we have now, can think they are perfect and divinely ordained. Dispute the sumptuousness of that blessing for a biography that seeks balance and a biographer who seeks credibility. We are fortunate to have another nonagenarian today in Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya. He reminded me yesterday that he was only 92 and fit enough to reach out to his books, write his debate, engagement, and sometimes collaboration between H.D. Deve Gowda and Atal Bihari Vajpayee were arguably the unlikeliest of it all. The two would have never interacted as much if they had not been prime ministers and former prime ministers, and if one had not preceded and succeeded the other. Gowda succeeded Vajpayee immediately after his first 13-day brush with power, and there was the motion of confidence in which the two came face to face for the first time on the floor of the parliament. The frequency and intensity were never lost till Vajpayee lost power in 2004. Briefly, between 1999 and 2002, there was a hiatus when Gowda was out of parliament. Otherwise, for nearly 7 years, Gowda never missed an opportunity to engage Vajpayee. Gowda and Vajpayee were two very different people. Vajpayee was essentially a Hindi person. Gowda used English to communicate, which in reality was notches above Vajpayee's felicity. If Vajpayee was full of rhetoric, flourish, and pregnant silences, Gowda was always about dry details, documents, and a kind of drawl. When Vajpayee shifted his stances and positions, even on some of the most visible issues of the day, it was seldom noticed and never remembered. But Gowda's consistency was always put under the scanner. If Vajpayee invariably got the benefit of doubt, Gowda was always placed in doubt. Nothing stuck to Vajpayee, no allegation or diatribe, but everything stuck to Gowda, and many a times unfairly. Vajpayee was about grandstanding. Gowda was about trench fights. One was a Brahmin and another Shudra, and the perception about them, their refinements and commitment invariably had undercurrents of caste, traditions, geography, history, and plain old prejudice. When one reads Gowda's parliamentary speeches and interventions, it is quite revealing as to how many times, both as a sitting and former prime minister, and even earlier as an MP, he resorted to supplication through words like request, plead, and beg to be ordinarily heard during debates. He often reminded his colleagues that he was from a humble background and was not so highly learned. This, despite a reasonably good engineering diploma coupled with strong political and legislative experience of decades. His grasp of the law and its loopholes were legendary in Karnataka. Yet, Gowda never realized his importance and he continued to beseech attention for his utterances. The weight of his vast experience and his learning, mostly self-taught, never added a dimension to his otherwise robust image of a refined political wrestler because there was nobody to package it for him. He perhaps did not even know that it could be packaged. He preferred to be in a groove of his own. He was cerebral in his own way. Vajpayee never had any of this problem ever. When he stood up to speak, people sat down to listen. There were many to add frills, flowers, and put on a pedestal what he had uttered and had not uttered. He was always presented as a representative of a great but suppressed philosophical current, of some glorious ideological value system that had been in chains, and of a gentleness and scholarship that had not received its due. Vajpayee even romanced the victimhood that constructed his political persona. When in the opposition benches, Vajpayee managed a guilt in people that despite being such a picture of perfection, was not on the treasury benches. When he finally moved to the treasury benches, the guilt was still kept alive. Gowda and Vajpayee's exchanges in parliament mostly concerned communalism, the farm economy, water disputes, the economy in general and governance in the same order of importance. George Fernandes, a minister in Vajpayee's cabinet and a fellow Kannadiga, was also a cause of conflict between the two many a times. On all topics, Gowda spoke with his field reports, assessments of experts, legal inputs, data points, and enormous common sense. He made thorough use of the Parliament library, but never brandished his reading or blended it with panache into his arguments. But if somebody questioned him, he would surprise them with his breadth of understanding. In his first ever session and first ever speech in Parliament in July 1991, when the motion of thanks to the President's address was being discussed, Gowda started speaking on the Union government's plan to notify the interim order of the Kaveri Tribunal. Manishankar Iyer, Mayiladuthurai MP, objected. Quote, "Sir, I am on a point of order. Is it in order for a member to devote, as he threatens to do, his entire speech to a subject which has not been mentioned in the President's address?" Unquote. Gowda responded, quote, "The President's address makes a mention about the development of irrigation. Though I am a new member to this House, I know that anything can be discussed during the debate on the presidential address. Within the ambit of rules framed by this very House, I know my limitations. Though I am a new entrant in this House, being a member in the state legislature for more than 20 years, actually close to 30 years in 1991, I know my limitations." What he meant was that he was experienced enough to know the rules. As Gowda continued, Iyer intervened again. Quote, "May I ask the honorable member a question? Does he or does he not accept the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court is the final authority on the law of the land?" Unquote. Gowda's instantaneous response put his memory, diligence, and the grasp of details on display. Quote, this is Mr. Gowda speaking. Quote, "I really want to compliment my friend. This is an Interstate Disputes Act," and he's speaking from memory, he's not reading out anything. "I really want to compliment my friend. This is an Interstate Disputes Act. A tribunal has been constituted under sections 3 and 4 of this act, which has been framed by this very same House, though I was not a member in those days. I am just a new entrant, and I would like to draw your attention to section 11 of the Interstate Disputes Act, which says, notwithstanding anything contained in any law, any other law, neither the Supreme Court nor any other court shall have or exercise jurisdiction in respect of any water dispute which is referred to a tribunal under this act." Unquote. Gowda was extremely sharp and well informed as a parliamentarian and as a prime minister. He was never underprepared. His collection of books, too, was eclectic. He collected all kinds of reports on subjects of interest to him. He personally clipped articles from magazines and newspapers and placed them in files which only he knew how to access at the most appropriate time. Knowledge meant one thing to Vajpayee. It could be both emotional and unproductive, like the poetry he wrote. But with Gowda, knowledge was about application. It had no other connotation other than information and data, something he could gainfully deploy either for the good of policy, effective action, or to fell his opponents. It could be said that knowledge for him was like soil. It had to be felt, had to be fertile, and finally give a good yield. The only abstraction he perhaps indulged in was his prayer books and the various editions and exegesis of the two Indian epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. But that too was not abstract for him. They were scaffolds around his soul. Thank you very much.
ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು 600 ಪುಟ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಯಿತು ಅಂತೇಳಿ. 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಿದಂಥವ್ರನ್ನ 600 ಪುಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು ಕೂಡ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಕಷ್ಟವಾದ ಕೆಲಸ. ಅದನ್ನು ಸುಗತ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸುಗತ ಅಟಲ್ಜಿ ಮತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ನಡುವೆ ನಡೆದಂಥ ಮಾತುಕತೆಗಳನ್ನು ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾಪ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ನೀವು ಒಂದು ಅಂಶವನ್ನು ಗಮನಿಸಿರಬೇಕು. 1991ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಸನದಿಂದ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ಲೋಕಸಭೆಗೆ ಅವರು ಹೋದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊದಲನೇ ವಿಷಯ ಅವರು ಎತ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದು ಕಾವೇರಿ. 1962ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ವಿಧಾನಸಭೆಗೆ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ಒಬ್ಬ ಬಂಡಾಯ ಅಭ್ಯರ್ಥಿಯಾಗಿ ಹೊಳೆನರಸೀಪುರ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರದಿಂದ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯಾಗಿ ವಿಧಾನಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಭಾಷಣವೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾವೇರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೇ ಇತ್ತು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾದರೂ ಕಾವೇರಿನೇ, ಸಂಸದರಾದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾವೇರಿನೇ, ಯಾವುದೇ ಸದನ ಆದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅದು ಕಾವೇರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೇ ಅವರ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಮಾತು. ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಇಷ್ಟೇ, ಅವರ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಏನಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ರೈತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ನೀರಾವರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಹಳ್ಳಿಗಾಡಿನ ಬದುಕಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಒಂದು ವಿಪರ್ಯಾಸ ನನಗೆ ಕಂಡಿದ್ದು ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಸುಗತ ಸೇರಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಅಂದರೆ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ವಿಷಯ ಹಳ್ಳಿಗಾಡಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಬರೆದಿರೋದು ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ, ಬರ್ತಿರೋದು ಸುಗತ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ ರಾಜು, ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಇಂಟರ್ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಸೆಂಟರು ಮತ್ತು ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಎಂಡ್ ಹೋಟೆಲ್ನಲ್ಲಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ತದ್ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾಗಿರುವಂಥ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳು. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದರೆ ಅವರೊಂದು ಹಾಸನದ ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೇಡಿಯಂನಲ್ಲಿ, ಅಥವಾ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ಮೈದಾನದಲ್ಲಿ, ಅಥವಾ ಇನ್ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ರಾಮನಗರನೋ ಚನ್ನಪಟ್ಟಣನೋ ಆಯ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಜನಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಇದು ಬಿಡುಗಡೆ ಆಗಲಿ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ನಿರೀಕ್ಷೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಕಾರಣ, ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಅಪರೂಪವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣುವಂಥವರು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು. ಬಹುತೇಕ ದಾವೋಸಿಗೆ ಹೋದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೇ ಜುಬ್ಬ ಹಾಕೊಂಡೇ ಹೋದಂಥ ಅಪರೂಪದ ಪ್ರಧಾನಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಕೂಡ ಒಬ್ಬರು. ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಅಧಿಕಾರ, ಸ್ಥಾನಮಾನ ಅಥವಾ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಗಳು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದ ಮೇಲೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅನೇಕ ಬಾರಿ ನಾನು ಅವ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮಾತಾಡುವಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಅದೃಷ್ಟನೋ ದುರಾದೃಷ್ಟನೋ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ವಿಷಯ, ಯಾಕೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ಅವತ್ತು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಂದ ಸ್ಪರ್ಧೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ಆದಂಥ ನಷ್ಟ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಗೆ ದೊಡ್ಡ ನಷ್ಟ ಆಯಿತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಈಗ ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ವಿಚಾರ. ಅವತ್ತು ಅವರಿಗಿನ್ನು 28-29 ವರ್ಷ, ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಪ್ರತಿಸ್ಪರ್ಧಿ ಆಗಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅವರು ಆದರೂ ಅವರಿಗೆ ನಿರಾಕರಿಸಿದರು. ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರು ಭಾಳ ವಿಧಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು, ದೇವರಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಅವರ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ನಕ್ಷತ್ರವೇ ಆ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಹೋರಾಟದಿಂದಲೇ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಸ್ವಂತ ಪ್ರತಿಭೆಯಿಂದ, ಸ್ವಂತ ಹೋರಾಟದಿಂದಲೇ ಗಳಿಸಬೇಕೆ ಹೊರತಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರ ಮರ್ಜಿಯಿಂದ ಗಳಿಸಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರಿಗಿದ್ದಂಥ ಒಂದು ವಿಧಿ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅವತ್ತಿನಿಂದ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿ 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭವಾದಂಥ ಹೋರಾಟ 2021ರಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ನಿಂತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಹೋರಾಟದ ಬದುಕೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಹಂತದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಹೋರಾಟ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಒಬ್ಬ ಭಾರತದ ಅಥವಾ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಒಬ್ಬ ಎದುರಾಗಿ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಥರನೇ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಅಪೇಕ್ಷೆ ಪಡಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ವಾದ ಮಾಡೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಪ್ರತಿಸ್ಪರ್ಧಿ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಮುಖಾಮುಖಿ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮ ತಿಳುವಳಿಕೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಜ್ಞಾನ, ನಮ್ಮ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ ಬೆಳೀತದೆ ಹೊರತಾಗಿ ಅದರಿಂದ ನಷ್ಟ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದು ಏನೂ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಾನು ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತೇನೆ. ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಲಿಟರರಿ ಫೆಸ್ಟಿವಲ್ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಗತನು ಭಾಗವಹಿಸಿದ್ದು, ಅವರು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದು ನಾನು ಓದಿದೆ. ಸುಗತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಕೆಲವು ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಡ್ಲೈನ್ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ವಾ. ನೀವು ಹೇಳಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ 6 ದಶಕಗಳ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಿದ ನಂತರವೂ ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಹೌದು ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಸರ್ಟಿಫಿಕೇಟ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಉತ್ತರ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಪರನೋ ವಿರೋಧ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿಯ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಅನ್ನತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಇರೋದು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲಾದಂಥ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ವಿಪರ್ಯಾಸ. ನಾನು ಕಾನೂನು ಓದಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷದ ನಾಯಕರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಕುತೂಹಲಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ನಾವು ಆಗಾಗ ಶಾಸನ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಮತ್ತು ದೇವರಾಜ ಅರಸರ ಮಧ್ಯ ನಡೆಯುವಂಥ ವಾದ ವಿವಾದಗಳು, ಪ್ರತಿವಾದಗಳನ್ನು ಕೇಳದೆ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಷನ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ನೋಡಿದ ಹಾಗೆ ಆಗುವಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸಂದರ್ಭಗಳು. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೂ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಷನ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಇತ್ತು ಆಗ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅದು ನೋಡೋಂಥ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭ. ಅದಾದ ನಂತರ JP ಚಳುವಳಿ, ಅದಾದ ನಂತರ ಜನತಾ ಪಾರ್ಟಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಸರ್ತಿ ನಾನು, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು, ಸಿಂಧ್ಯಾರವರು ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ಮದುವೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ವಿ. ಆಗ ಒಂದು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಪಕ್ಷದ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಪ್ಲೈಮತ್ ಕಾರ್ ಇತ್ತು ಒಂದು ಪಕ್ಷದ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಿಗೆ. ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ವಾಪಸ್ ಬರಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಶ್ರೀರಂಗಪಟ್ಟಣದ ಹತ್ರ ಕಾರ್ ಕೆಟ್ಟು ದಾರಿ ನಿಂತಿದ್ವಿ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ ಪ್ರಸಾದ್ ಮದುವೆ ಅಂತ ನೆನಪು ನನಗೆ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಸಿಂಧಿಯರವ್ರನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಏನು ಇವನು ಶಂಕರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮದುವೆ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಂಸಾಹಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ನಲ್ಲ, ಏನು ಇವನು ಸಮಾಚಾರ ಏನು ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಅಷ್ಟೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ನನಗೂ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಪರಿಚಯ 4-5 ವರ್ಷ ಆಗೋಗಿತ್ತು. ಆಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಆ ಮದುವೆ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಮಾಂಸಾಹಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಅವ್ರು ಏನು ಇವನು, ಅವ್ರು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಇವನು ಒಕ್ಕಲಿಗ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಇವನು ಯಾರೋ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ, ಶೃಂಗೇರಿ ಚಿಕ್ಕಮಗಳೂರು ಕಡೆನೋ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ ಮತ್ತೊಂದೇನೋ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಸಸ್ಯಾಹಾರ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಏನು ಸರ್ ನೀವು ಅವನು ಚಿಕ್ಕಮಗಳೂರು ಗುಡಿಗೆರೆ ಒಕ್ಕಲಿಗ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಅವರು ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ 4-5 ವರ್ಷ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದ ನಂತರನೂ ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಯಾವುದು ಓದಿದವನು, ಯಾವುದು ನನ್ನ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ್ದು, ಏನು ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಗೊತ್ತಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅವರು ಒಬ್ಬನಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಮರ್ಥ್ಯ ಇತ್ತು, ಶಕ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತು, ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಉತ್ತರ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ, ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಬಂದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ, ಯಾಕೆ ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಷ್ಟು ಪರೀಕ್ಷಿಸಲ್ಪಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮತ್ತೊಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಇದ್ದಾನೆ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ಭಾವಿಸಿದ್ದೆ. ಈ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳೋದ್ರಿಂದ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ನನಗೆ ಈ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಲಾಭವೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದೆ ಹೋಗಿ ನಷ್ಟವೂ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಬೆಳೆದೋಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು 6 ದಶಕಗಳ ರಾಜಕಾರಣವನ್ನು ನೀವೇನಾದರೂ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಅವರು ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಧನೆ. ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಷ್ಟಿದ್ದರೂ ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ. ಇವತ್ತು 62ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸನಸಭೆಯನ್ನು ಪ್ರವೇಶ ಮಾಡಿದವರು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಇಬ್ಬರೇ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, S.N. ಕೃಷ್ಣರವರು ಮತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು. ಆದರೆ ಸಕ್ರಿಯ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಒಬ್ಬರೇ. ಹಾಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನು ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಇದೆ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನು ಇಷ್ಟಪಡದೇ ಇರೋ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆಯೂ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪ್ರಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿದೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ. ಆದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ನಿರ್ಲಕ್ಷ್ಯ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ವರ್ಗ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದಿಲ್ಲ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅವನು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಿರ್ಲಕ್ಷ್ಯ ಮಾಡಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಧನೆ. 6 ವರ್ಷಗಳ 60 ದಶಕಗಳ ಕಾಲ 6 ದಶಕ 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ ಪ್ರಸ್ತುತರಾಗಿ ಉಳಿಯತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಭಾಳ ಸುಲಭದ ಕೆಲಸ ಏನಲ್ಲ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ದಿನಮಾನದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಅದೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳು ತಪ್ಪು ಅಂತ ನಂತರವೂ ಕೂಡ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಿದೆ. ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ, ಅವರ ಜೀವನದ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಹೋರಾಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬ ಹೋರಾಟಗಾರ, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಇರುವಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬ ನಾಯಕ, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕಿಗೆ ಸಮರ್ಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ಶಾಸನ ಸಭೆ ಸಂಸತ್ತಿನ ಅನುಭವದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇವಲ 5-6 ವರ್ಷ ಮಾತ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಉಳಿತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಆಗಿದ್ದು ಈ ದೇಶದ, ಈ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಲೋಪಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಅಂತಾದರೂ ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ದಿನಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾದ ಕೂಡಲೇ ಸಚಿವರಾಗಬೇಕು, ಸಚಿವರಾಗಿ ಆದ ತಕ್ಷಣವೇ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಬಯಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವರಿಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾಗಿ 83ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿ ಸಚಿವರಾದರು. 85ರಲ್ಲಿ 2ನೇ ಬಾರಿ ಸಚಿವರಾದರು, ಭಾಳ ಸಮಯ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ 94ರವರೆಗೂ ಕಾಯಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಿಂದ ಪ್ರಥಮ ಪ್ರಧಾನಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಹೆಮ್ಮೆ ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಇದ್ದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಯಾಗಿಯೇ ಮುಂದುವರೆದಿದ್ದರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದ ಇತಿಹಾಸನೇ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ನನ್ನ ಖಚಿತವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ. ಇದು ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಸುಗತಾ ಅವರ ಹತ್ರ. ಅನೇಕ ನನಗೆ ಏನು ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತದೋ ಅಷ್ಟನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಸಂತೋಷದ ವಿಷಯ ಅಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲದನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಓದಿದಾರಂತೆ. ಓದಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ನ್ಯಾಯಯುತವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದಾರಂತೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಪರವಾಗೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಅನೇಕ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಆಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡುವಷ್ಟು ದೊಡ್ಡವನ್ನ ನಾನು ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಹೋದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಸರಿ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತಿದ್ದರೆ ನಾನು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಎಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿನ ಸಲಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ನಾವು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು ಅಂದರೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ, ಇವತ್ತಿನ ನಾಯಕರುಗಳು ಭೇಟಿ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಕೊಡುವಂಥ ಪರಿಪಾಠಗಳನ್ನು ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ಅವ್ರ ಮನೆಗೆ ಬಾಗಿಲು ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದೆ, ಬಹುತೇಕ ಮಲಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಬಾಗಿಲು ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಬೆಳಿಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದರೆ ರಾತ್ರಿ ಮಲಗುವವರೆಗೂ ಇಲ್ಲವೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಶೇವಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಗಲೂ ಜನ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದದ್ದು ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಊಟ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಗಂತೂ ಸುತ್ತ 10 ಜನ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಊಟನೇ ಸೇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಈ ಥರದ ಅನೇಕ ಸರಳತೆಯ ನಡವಳಿಕೆಗಳನ್ನು ನಾನು ಅವರಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ದುರದೃಷ್ಟ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಮರ್ಥ್ಯದ ಅನುಭವದ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ಸದ್ಬಳಕೆ ಆಗಲಿಲ್ವಲ್ಲ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಕೊರಗು ಇವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ 69ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಭಾಗ ಆದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಯಾರು 2 ಬಾರಿ ಟಿಕೆಟನ್ನು ನಿರಾಕರಿಸಿದ್ರು ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಸೇರೋದ್ರ ಬದಲಿಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ನಿರ್ಧಾರನೆ ಮಾಡಿದರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದ ಚಿತ್ರಣವೂ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಆದರೆ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೊಂದು ಪರ್ಯಾಯವಾದಂಥ ಪಕ್ಷವನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟುವಂಥದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ವಹಿಸಿದಂಥ ಪರಿಶ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಹಿನ್ನಡೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಮಟ್ಟಿನ ಸತ್ಯ. ಆದರೆ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಇರುವಂಥವ್ರು, ಅಧಿಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಎಂದೂ ಕೂಡ ರಾಜಿ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳದೇ ಇದ್ದಂಥವ್ರು, ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸುದೀರ್ಘವಾದಂಥ ರಾಜಕೀಯ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಎಷ್ಟು ಸ್ನೇಹಿತರನ್ನು ಗಳಿಸಿದಾರೋ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ವಿರೋಧಿಗಳನ್ನು ಗಳಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಪರೂಪವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ. ಯಾರೇ ಆದರೂ ಕೂಡ 1933ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿ ಮೇ 18ನೇ ತಾರೀಕು ಮುಂದಿನ ವರ್ಷ ಬಂದರೆ 90ಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾಲಿಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಮೇ 18ಕ್ಕೆ ಈ ಕ್ಷಣದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಸವಾಲುಗಳನ್ನ ಸ್ವೀಕರಿಸೋದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರಿಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಧೈರ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಹಸ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಅದು ಬಹಳ ಅಪರೂಪವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಸುಗತಾ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರಾಜು ಅವರು ಹಲವು ಬಾರಿ ನನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಬರೆಯುವಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದರು, ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡಿದರು, ಅನೇಕ ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಾದಷ್ಟು ನಾನು ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶಾತ್ಮಕವಾಗಿಯೇ ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಹೊರತು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಬೆಳೆಸಿದಂಥ, ನಮಗೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬರು ನಾಯಕರು ಅನ್ನೋ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ ಅವರ ನಿಜವಾದಂಥ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಚ್ಯುತಿ ಬರುವಂಥ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳುವಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ನಾನು ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ತಪ್ಪಿದ್ರೆ ತಪ್ಪು, ಸರಿ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಸರಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನೇ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ಬಲವಾಗಿ ವಿಧಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಎಲ್ಲ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳು ವಿಧಿಯ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ವಿಧಿ ಕಾರಣ ಅಂತ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ತೀರ್ಮಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಯೋಗ್ರಫಿ ವಿಚಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಚಿರಂಜೀವಿ ಸಿಂಗ್ ಅವರು ಮತ್ತು ಮೀನಾಕ್ಷಿ ಸುಂದರಂ ಅವರು ಹೇಳಿದಂಥ ಮಾತು ಸತ್ಯ. ಬಯೋಗ್ರಫಿ ಬರೀತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದಷ್ಟು ಸುಲಭ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಒಂದು ಭಾಳ ಕ್ಲಿಷ್ಟಕರವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ, ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಕಷ್ಟವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಡೋದು ಅಂದರೆ ಸುಲಭ ಅಂತೂ ಅಲ್ಲವೇ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಬೇರೆಯವ್ರನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಭಾಳಷ್ಟು ವಿಷಯಗಳು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರ್ಬೋದು. ಆದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಒಂದು ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತರ್ಮುಖಿ. ನಾನು ಕಂಡಾಗೆ ಅನೇಕ ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನ ತಾವೇ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ತಾವೇ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಅಪರೂಪ. ಅತ್ಯಂತ ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದ ನಂತರ, ಅದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟದ ದಿನಗಳಿತ್ತು ಅದು ಬೇರೆ ವಿಷಯ. ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದ ನಂತರ, ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ಭಾಳ ಆತ್ಮೀಯರಾದ ನಂತರ ಅನೇಕ ಕಷ್ಟದ ದಿನಗಳನ್ನು ರಾಜಕೀಯದಲ್ಲೂ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ವೈಯಕ್ತಿಕ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು 1989ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿಯಿಂದ 1991ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಸದಸ್ಯರಾಗಿ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯಾಗಿದ್ದವರಿಗೆ ಪಟ್ಟಂಥ ಪರಿಪಾಠ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಅದು ಯಾವ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ಬರಬಾರದು ಅಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ಅವ್ರು ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದನ್ನು ಆ 2-3 ವರ್ಷ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಇದ್ದವರಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಕೂಡ ಅರ್ಥಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಎದೆಗುಂತಿರೋ ಅದು ಕೂಡ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಒಂದು ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಇದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಇಷ್ಟೇ, ಅನೇಕ ಜನ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಕ್ರಿಯರಾಗಿರೋರು ಇಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೀರಿ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾರ್ಯಾಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ಇದ್ದೀರಿ, ನ್ಯಾಯಾಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ಇದ್ದೀರಿ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ಬ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕು, ಒಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಯ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇವತ್ತು ಬರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳು, ಇವತ್ತಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಗಳು ಏನಿದ್ದಾವೋ ಅದು ಹಾಗೇ ಇರಲಿ. ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅನೇಕ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆಗಳು ಇದ್ದಾವೆ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಇವತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲರನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಪರ್ಸೆಂಟೇಜ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳಿತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಾನು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಆತ್ಮವಿಶ್ವಾಸದಿಂದ ದೃಢವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳಬಲ್ಲೆ, ಆ ಪರ್ಸೆಂಟೇಜ್ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಿಂದ ಹೊರತಾಗಿದ್ದ ಒಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಅದು ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನು ಅನುಭವದಿಂದ ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ನಾನು ನಂಬಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮನಸ್ಸು ಮಾಡಿದರೆ ಅವರು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಪಕ್ಷವನ್ನೇ ಕಟ್ಟುವಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪರ್ಕ ಸಾಧನೆಗಳು ಅವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ನಾನು ಗಮನಿಸಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ತನ್ನ ಸಹಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ನಾನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸತ್ಯ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಮಾನ್ಯ ಸುಗತಾ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರಾಜು ಅವರಿಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ಇಷ್ಟು ಅಚ್ಚುಕಟ್ಟಾಗಿ ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸ್ತೇನೆ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಸಲ್ಲಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಈ ಎಲ್ಲ ವಿಷಯಗಳು ಕೂಡ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ತರ್ಜುಮೆಯಾಗಿ ಬಂದರೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ದೊಡ್ಡ ನ್ಯಾಯವನ್ನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಗ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿ, ಈ ವಿಚಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೇ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿದರೆ ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಗಾಗಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರು ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಈ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ಪಯಣದ ಹಾದಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಒಂದು ಶಕ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಿಂತಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರು ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಕೂಡ ಈಗ ನಾನು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಕೃತಜ್ಞತೆಯಿಂದ ಸ್ಮರಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಪ್ರಣಾಮಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸಿ ಅವಕಾಶಕ್ಕೆ ವಂದಿಸಿ ನಾನು ಮಾತನಾಡುತ್ತೇನೆ.
Talk to this audience. It is very difficult to write a biography. I had worked under 3 prime ministers and I wanted to write something about the comparative study of the 3 prime ministers. I have not been able to do it. For several years I attempt, but it is extremely difficult to write a person. And it is more difficult to write a biography of a person who is living and who has a background of some 60-70 years. Sugata has done a very good job in looking at the event and also giving his own views. Supposing if I have written the biography of Sri Deve Gowda, or if he himself has written his autobiography, there is a possibility of our being biased. We were a part of the entire story. So when we write, we tend to become maybe partial. The advantage which Sugata had is that he has not been a party to any of this act. He has the advantage of standing outside after 25 years, looking at what has happened and making an assessment. It's not easy, but he has done a very good job. The one thing which I appreciate is there is nothing in writing. There is no document about any politician of Karnataka. Karnataka has produced a large number of politicians who have started in Karnataka and went on to Government of India and did some good work there. But about none of them we have got any book. The only book I saw, maybe others can correct me, is the autobiography of Nijalingappa. It has been published somewhere in the year 2000. Other than that, I have not seen any book in English talking about the chief ministers of Karnataka or any prominent politician in Karnataka. This is something in a federal system, the state is as important as the center. We write about the central government, we write about the prime ministers, but we don't write about any politician in the state. Now this will start a new trend. We will start respecting the people. I understand only in Tamil Nadu there is an attempt now to write the biography of Mr. Karunanidhi in English. I don't know whether it has come out or not. At least somebody says that we will write. But this is the starter now. This has given a very good idea, and as Chiranjeev very rightly said, it has projected Mr. Deve Gowda not as a politician only, but also as an excellent human being. I have the honor of working with him for several years. I have noticed a number of good qualities in him which have all been reflected very truly in this book. I did not tell that to him. He himself found out and wrote all that. The thing which I liked most in Mr. Deve Gowda, which probably had missed in this book, is his magnanimity. Once he told me, when we were talking about an officer, he told me a sentence which I still remember. He said, ದೇವರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾನೆ, ನಾವು ಸಣ್ಣತನ ತೋರಿಸಬಾರದು. When there is a possibility of hitting a person, there was a very good chance. I talked to him, sir, what do you do in this case? Then he gave me this. We shall not be small. Let us do something big. God has given us a position and we must make use of it for the good of the people and not to punish any person. This is a lesson which I learnt from him. See, in a democracy, The relationship between the bureaucrat and the politician is always difficult. Sometimes it is very good, sometimes it is not. I must say with Mr. Deve Gowda, I never had a single minute where I felt bad for working with a politician. That is the great quality. The second thing which the book covers very clearly his trust in his officers. I miss Mr. T.R. Satish Chandran now. In fact, he is the more appropriate person to come and talk to you in this gathering than me. Unfortunately, since he is no more, I have to say something about him also. He is the person who can give his opinion very frankly, and Mr. Deve Gowda used to respect his views. That is something great in a politician. It was never the case where he overruled him. If there is any difference of opinion between the principal secretary and the PM, that will be sent to me. And Sri Deve Gowda will tell me, can you go and tell Mr. Satish Chandran and ask him to reconsider this? He will not overrule him on the file. He has never overruled. I will have to go back and find a compromise between the two and ensure that what is good for the people is carried out. This is something very good in him, the trust. I have a number of stories to say, but I will not say that now. He has a great trust in his officers, and he once told me, I believe in my officers. Without them, I cannot work. Supposing, I asked him once, supposing if they double cross, what will you do? He said, no, I will not keep such a person in my office. Before taking a person into my office, I do a lot of research. And once I take him, I trust him. And that has always been the case. We were happy to work with him. One other thing which I noticed in the book is something very good. How he takes his success as well as defeat in the same way. See, many of us get worried when we lose. But Sri Deve Gowda had never been having that. Even after being the Prime Minister, he lost a couple of elections. But he did not lose his heart. As Chiranjeev said, he will come back and he will get along very well with the people. It has been a great pleasure working with him. And I am glad that the book captures all these good qualities and also mentions whatever be the problems, the Brutus Act, all that comes in the book very beautifully. It is a very difficult job. I think he must have interviewed some 50, 60 people or more, 80 people. And not only his interview, he has cross-checked also. I read in his book, whatever I said about Mr. Chidambaram and Mr. Deve Gowda, he has cross-checked with Mr. Chidambaram, and he makes a reply saying that I don't remember it exactly, but if Mr. Deve Gowda and Mr. Meenakshi Sundaram have said this, that must be correct. I will agree with that. So to that extent, he has gone, made a cross-check and ensured that whatever is true comes out in the book. So I am very happy about reading this book. The only one shortcoming which I noticed was the book is very large. You can't read it in one go. It will take at least about a week for you. A person like me who is very much involved in this, I could not read the book in one go. But I sympathize with him. Taking the life of a person who has been very active over 60 to 70 years, you can't put that in 100 pages. You do need some 500, 600 pages to capture. So I realize the problem. No harm in that. We will read the book. If it takes 1 week, so what? We will spend the time and read it carefully. And it's a very good book. As Chiranjeev said, this is going to be a trendsetter for future things to come. 1, people writing about state leaders. 2, people writing about a politician as a human being. These are things which will come. I wish you all the best and thank you very much for giving us an opportunity of meeting the people here. Thank you very much.
My first memory of Gowda Sahab is as leader of opposition. I was Deputy Secretary to Mr. Devrajars and he was leader of the opposition. So it was my duty to sit in the assembly when Mr. Ars had to be there. And the first image I have of Gowda Sahab is as leader of opposition, he stood up. I don't remember the subject, but he was so impassioned and angry that his face had become red and he shouted, and you can I mean, this generation probably cannot imagine the strength with which he could speak in those years. He said, Elli Nyaya. I think that can be the leitmotif of his life and this book also. His achievements in Kashmir, Nagaland, Bangladesh, irrigation, agriculture, etc., and agriculture, I think the finest compliment has been paid to him by the farmers of Punjab, about which Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya also mentioned, and which is there in the book. But to my mind, some of the most moving passages in the book are about his early years, his struggles, and as a person. I would just read one of the very moving passages. His father is unwell, and he goes to a temple and he says, "If I am my father's son, he should die in my lap." Later, I suffered from enormous guilt that I had used this phrase before God, which put a question mark on my mother's integrity. I got into a spiral on this indiscretion and suffered for a few days. The father breathed his last in his lap. I mean, this is the kind of moving thing which is there in the book at various places. Now, when Sugata was writing, each chapter he would email to me as it was written, and I would go through it and then give my comments and suggestions for whatever they were worth for. And I once told him during our discussions, I said, R.K. Narayan, who was a very dear friend of mine, and I was his evening walk companion for 6 years during my Mysore posting. He said, I don't read Indian biographies, they are boring because there is no love life in them. No, I told Sugata as the book was being written that Sugata, this is an unput-downable biography even if there is no love life in it. But even there I was mistaken when the book came out, because there is again a very moving passage. Mr. Gowda goes to Kashmir, looks at the beauty of Kashmir, and he thinks, I should have brought along my wife. Well, you see, this is what humanizes the biography. As I mentioned, in future, people will be talking about his achievements in Bangladesh, in Nagaland, in Kashmir, in the field of irrigation, agriculture, etc. But in a political biography, to maintain the balance between the personal and the official and political is a very difficult trick. And it's to Sugata's credit that he has been able to do this. What comes out in the book is not the politician alone. What comes out in the book is the man, Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda, who in Kashmir thinks of his wife, who when the father is ill wants the father to die in his lap, and when in despair he comes out, because that reminds me of one of the lines in one of my favorite books, Anne of Green Gables, which says, to despair is to turn your back on God. He never turned his back on God, therefore he came out of despair always. And that's why there is this phrase that he would rise like, and he rose like a phoenix. Sugata has done ample justice to his subject, and as I mentioned in the beginning, he has set a standard for political biographies to come in future. Another thing which I found very thought-provoking, you see, since the beginning, since Plato's and Aristotle's times, there is this debate as to free will and predestination and destiny. Any thinking person after reading this biography would be mulling on this problem once again. What is free will and what is destination? Destiny. Mr. Gowda's great achievement is that he has been able to bridge the two. Those who wish to seek an answer to this question, whether it is free will or it is destiny, should read this book. I think that's another takeaway from this book which many people will remember in future. Any thinking person would think about it, because that is why one of his astrologers said that he was a sthit prajna. This quality comes from this balance between what he believes is the destiny and what he believes is the karma. He's a karma yogi who doesn't believe in nishkam karma. And that's why he has succeeded. And the great merit of this biography is that it humanizes a politician, gives him his due, places him in the social and political context, brings out his achievements, and makes the book so interesting that you can read it like a novel. It is an epic journey which he has recorded. Sugata has done a marvelous thing. And Penguins deserve a round of applause for bringing it out so well. The cover is also very well designed. The book is very well produced, and that's also an achievement. Sugata, all compliments to you for a very brilliant biography. He has outdone himself in this work.
Prime Minister in 1996. Right? And when we look at the history of India from 1947 to 1996 and the Prime Ministers who had preceded Mr. Gowda, you see a pattern. There was, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, who were, of course, part of the Gandhi family and eminent personalities in their own right. The others who had become Prime Minister before Mr. Gowda. When we look at, say, Mr. Moraji Desai, right? He was from the Congress table, went against the Congress. He was a Brahmin by birth, right? Had a number of years in politics, had spent a number of years in national politics as a minister. If you look at Mr. Charan Singh, right? He was, of course, not a high caste person, right? But still, he was from the Hindi heartland, a Hindi-speaking person from the politically important state of Uttar Pradesh. Right? Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, of course, again belonged to the Gandhi family. The first Prime Minister from South India, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, again a Brahmin by caste, and part of the Congress, enormous cultural capital, very well learned and all of that. So when you look at all these personalities and you look at the personality of Mr. Gowda, right? A rank outsider, not high caste, spent a lot of time in state politics, but had not spent too much time in national politics. And yet he made it to the highest chair in the country. What would you comment on that? How did this come to pass? How did this happen?
Thank you, Karthik. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Mr. Deve Gowda was a rank outsider. And I say in this book that he was one Prime Minister who reached the highest position without any pelf, patronage or pedigree. And you're right about the other Prime Ministers. They either had social capital or cultural capital or from the Hindi belt, so there was a natural advantage. And even Mr. Narasimha Rao, who came from the south, was from the upper caste, and there was a natural accrual of social and cultural capital. And he had become a very Delhi person by the time he became Prime Minister. So Mr. Deve Gowda was the only one who did not have any of this infrastructure. I think we should also point out, Mr. Deve Gowda, like Mr. Narendra Modi, was not propelled by any organization. Mr. Modi became Prime Minister primarily because he had the huge infrastructure of the RSS. So Mr. Deve Gowda was a rank outsider to all of this. Line which would go down in history, he never traded his self-esteem for power. That is something that not just I reading into it, people who have deserted him today, people who fought elections against him, people who defeated him, people who have, done everything possible against him, tell me one thing, but sir, this is the underlying thing, he would never compromise his self-esteem perform. He'll just throw his resignation and go. He behaved like editors like us. We would always carry a resignation letter in our pocket. And he was like that as a minister. In fact, when I remember this thing about Manmohan Singh, I'll end with this. Manmohan Singh is caught in the, he's not caught, his government, Mr. Narasimha Rao's government is caught in the security scam. And he has resigned, at least token resignation is submitted. And he has still come to attend the house. And Mr. Deve Gowda gets up and he says, I have been a minister too. When I resigned, I never went to the house and spoke like a minister. Why have you come here? He's asking Mr. Manmohan Singh, it's part of the parliamentary record. I am not saying anything new, it's part of the parliamentary record. And the kind of tough time he gave Manmohan Singh between 1991 and 1994, I just quote from the parliamentary debates. And that is so enriching. And I had a chat with Dr. Singh Saab, and he acknowledges that was exemplary parliamentary debate on the part of Mr. Deve Gowda, which is never spoken about in Karnataka. That's the sad part.
That's a good.
Respected Honorable Sri Deve Gowda ji, esteemed Shriyuts Chiranjeev Singh, Meenakshi Sundaram, V.R. Shankar, author Sri Sugata Srinivas Raju, publishers, convened Random House, and esteemed audience, and the publishers of the esteemed publication. I am deeply sensible of the honor of this invitation to launch Furrows in the Field, a biography of an eminent Indian and the pride of Karnataka, the former Prime Minister Sri Deve Gowda. The biographer Sri Srinivas Raju has earned the gratitude of the Kannadigas for placing on record the single-handed achievements of this rare and gifted man, whose passionate commitment to the cause of the humble farmers of this land has indeed been the companion of his soul. In a shining expression of gratitude, the Punjab farmers named one of their exotic paddy saints as Deve Gowda paddy. Sri Deve Gowda is an obvious and preeminent choice for a biography. Sugata's impeccable credentials as a learned and discerning and a fiercely independent journalist adds a new dimension to the purpose of this inquiry. It comes after a quarter of a century of Deve Gowda's prime ministership. Every worthy biography has a message. To me, what Sugata desires to convey is relevant in the context of the traditions of democracy in India. Faith in democracy is really faith in its institutions. It is well known that when India declared its intention to adopt the republican model of parliamentary democracy with universal lateral franchise, the Western world was cynical of its success. How can, they doubted, 300 million illiterate people successfully operate a system of modern parliamentary democracy? The same Western plus 60 years later said Indian democracy was robust, but the rowdiest. This is a tribute to the innate, uncommon wisdom of the common man. It was once said by an eminent political leader that he would rather trust to the foolishness of 300 million people than the wisdom of 5 judges. But that faith in the wisdom of the electorate is now waning. If one looks at the lamentable state in public life, it becomes evident that in a democracy, people do not get a better government than they deserve. We do not have any others to blame except ourselves for the hopeless mess we have created for ourselves, ourselves and in our public institutions. The underlying theme of this book that Sugata seeks to convey seems to my mind to be We need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of Indian democracy. It can even be held to ransom, and that even individuals can sabotage democratic spirit. The story of Indian democracy, its strengths and weaknesses, is illustrated through the political career of a humble farmer who rose to great heights by his brilliant comprehension of the controlling forces and their intelligent management. Deve Gowda's genial, friendly exterior conceals a strong, determined mind inside, who by its own self-assurance can take on any challenge. The emergence of Deve Gowda as Prime Minister of the country, and the unfortunate and unhappy way his tenure was cut short, signify both the strength and weakness of our political system. Here was a man without any aristocratic political background or family inheritance or status, who became Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. And the way it was cut short is again the exasperation of Indian democracy that points to the perils of a precise hope. The perils of the precise hope. That short period cost up a commendable record of efficient administration. Deve Gowda as Prime Minister chose some of the best bureaucrats in the Prime Minister's Secretariat. One of them, Sri Meenakshi Sundaram, is with us here. The late Sri Satish Chandra was another administrator of extraordinary talent and competence. The Delhi Metro is another shining example of Deve Gowda's vision of the future. Though agriculture and farmers' welfare were and are still his all-consuming passion.